As we're waiting for folks to arrive, I'm just gonna start with a song. The song, it's by Rena Branson. I'm just gonna sing the wordless melody, and I'll use hand motions. And it's just a way of grounding as we like prepare to enter the learning. And you're welcome to sing along if you know it, or try to learn it as I'm singing, or just sit in silence, or you can write in the chat and introduce yourself. Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to see some new and some old faces here. Yeah, excited that you all are joining for this session. So this workshop's called Shmita, Release, Repair, and Reparations in Our Lives. And we're gonna be exploring kind of mapping Shmita onto current calls for reparations and understanding kind of this like ancient spiritual and economic system and what it can teach us about what's needed for justice today, and how we can connect to that in our own lives. And I think before we jump in, I just want to take a moment. I'm on occupied lands of the Sabbatical and Mohican people, and I extend enormous gratitude to the original stewards of these lands, and dedicate my learning to the ongoing struggle for Indigenous land sovereignty and cultural reclamation. And invite you all, if you want to write in the chat what lands you're on, maybe you already did that, and anything you want to dedicate your learning to today. And while folks are doing that, my name's Sol. I use they, them pronouns. I am a non-binary trans white Ashkenazi artist and community builder and farmer. I grew up in the Bay Area in Chochenyo Ohlone land, and a lot of my work in the world is inspired by the power of land-based community and exploring questions of societal healing through spiritual and economic relationships to land. I know that's a lot of what Urban Adamah is up to also. And I'm here as part of Link of Legal, which is a collective queer Jewish community farm and cultural organizing project I'm a part of in the Hudson Valley, building a radical diasporic Jewish future rooted in land, tradition, healing, and justice. And Link of Legal, through growing, nourishing food, cultivating land-based community, organizing for reparations, we attempt to co-create theory and practice for Jewish relationships to land and liberation. So excited to have you all here as part of that learning with us. And just some intentions for the space, like we are all learners here, and these are huge concepts that we're attempting to bring together into this inquiry. And just want to invite a culture of learning and curiosity and generosity. These are big topics. I will make mistakes, and I really welcome your feedback and want to stay in conversation, both either in the chat or if you want to reach out afterwards. Yeah, and it feels complicated to approach this conversation around racial justice and healing as a white person, and approach this work with contradiction, both being white and complicit in the systems that we're going to talk about, but also responsible to try to interrupt these systems in the ways that we can. So offer this class in service of that, in service of the lifelong journey around learning and action, and holding the complexity inside of these conversations. And I just want to apologize in advance for any harm that may happen in this space. And yeah, as I mentioned, I really want to be in conversation towards our collective learning and my own learning. Yeah, what do I want to say next? So some of the intentions of this class are to establish a personal relationship to these topics, inspire curiosity around the intersections of Jewish tradition and work for justice, leave with an understanding of how the values of Shmita are connected to the deconstruction of racial capitalism, inspire action for reparations and racial justice through our Jewish practice, and expand our imaginations. And some of the ways that we're hoping, hopefully we'll get to do that is we'll start with some personal reflection. I will share a Link of Legal's story of why we are drawn to these questions, and you'll have some space to reflect and share. After that, we're going to go into identifying the problem or the current situation around racial capitalism, and then look at it through an overview of Shmita, a little bit of context around where we're at now in terms of calls for reparations and what that means. Then we'll put these two ideas in conversation with each other to see how they can offer, what they can offer to our justice work today, with a couple moments for breakout groups throughout that. And we'll close with some resources for continued learning and action, and some space to reflect on how we want to take this into our own lives. Sound okay? Great. Thanks for all your dedication in the chat. So I'm going to start with just some storytelling, some about my story of relating to these questions and Link of Legal's story. In preparing this class, we came to questions of why is it important to bring these two things together? Why are we seeking to live at the intersection of these values? And in asking these questions, we came to realize that this is very much at the essence of Link of Legal as a project. And pretty much the Link of Legal's founding story is that in 2015, one of our co-founders, who is a queer white Jew with access to wealth, gave a reparations gift of 181 acres to Wild Seed Healing Village, which is a Black and brown led intentional community, organic farm, and political and creative home. And Wild Seed generously offered Link of Legal the use of 10 acres to build toward our dream of a radical land-based Jewish community. And through that process, where we've landed is that we have a lease to use this 10-acre piece of land for one Shmita cycle. So that was at the beginning of this Shmita cycle, and our time with this exact location is going to end at the end of next year, at the end of the Shmita year. So I share that story with a lot of sensitivity. It feels like it's vulnerable to share, it's complicated to share, and just inviting you all to hold the nuance with me, because at its heart, it's like easy to say in a few sentences, and at its heart, there's tender relationships and a lot of learning and a lot of growth. And part of why I want to share that is that to situate Link of Legal's origin in a political context and both understand how this project is exploring land-based Jewish liberation, and how that was rooted in political choices based in Shmita and reparations from its start. Sharing this imperfect and vulnerable story as just like as an example of like how are ways that we can kind of like peer into what bringing these two concepts together can look like in our communities and in our own lives. Just one example. So we're gonna go into some solo reflection time and invite you to journal or draw or however you wanna sit with these questions. The questions are what brought you to this class and what excites you about the intersection of these two topics, Shmita and reparations. And we'll have maybe share in the chat, or anyone who feels like sharing what you've come up with. We'll spend a few minutes on this. Folks can start wrapping up and share anything from that reflection in the chat. Actually, we have a little time, so if anyone wants to unmute and share out loud, we could do that too. It'd be great to hear.
I'll share that I was thinking about, like, I don't know much about Shmita, but thinking about the connections between like healing the land and also like land as healing and how that feels like kind of like a cycle between those two ideas.
Love that. Anyone else feel like sharing?
Sure. Hi. As somebody with class privilege and access to wealth, I feel like this is really something that I'm responsible toward in my lifetime of redistributing wealth. And it feels really good for me to have a Jewish framework and a cycle that it's part of. And I also feel like as a Jewish educator and leader, I could potentially expand my impact by reaching out to Jewish community from this Jewish tradition foundation. So hoping to spread the good word.
Yes. In the chat, Alexander said, exploring the potential for anti-capitalist time through Jewish practice. We get a portal into this every week with Shabbat, and every week I let it bleed further beyond the sundowns. Shmita, a year of rest, offers that extension to not only live a day, but a year outside of capitalist time, outside of the productivity that defines it, and outside of the hierarchies of supremacy that perpetuate its harm. A peek into the Messianic age. Yes, agree with all of that. Thank you. Anyone want to share one more thing before we keep going? Go for it. I think you might be muted. Sad. Deirdre, do you want to write in the chat so we can see what you're going to share? Okay, cool. Okay, while you're up to that, I'm going to move us along. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to ask those questions.
I think I might, can you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Okay. My daughter just came down and plugged in my mic, so that was very helpful. What I was going to say is that when I think about the connection of these issues with the Shmita cycle, I mean, it like what really resonates for me is the Jubilee or the Yovel opportunity, which is part of the Shmita cycle. It's like there's like a 7 Shmita cycles, and then there's something even bigger, and so it comes along every 50 years, and it's this. To me, it seems like it's reparations for everything, like for every harm and every accident of fortune, and like every way that a person can fall behind, like fall into a pit where they're unable to participate fully in the society, that the Yovel cycle is meant to kind of erase that and reestablish the opportunity for every person to meet their needs. And then, you know, it's sort of like the end of the Monopoly game. It's like after 50 years, somebody has won, somebody has like lost, and there's some people in the middle. And that, like, I just love this idea that in the Jubilee year, that the game, it kind of starts fresh and everybody has sort of like the same opportunities. So I just wonder, like, that's really where I see the idea of like reparations. And it's like, and it's reparations for those harms that were explicitly done to people, but it's also reparations for accidents and misfortune and all of the ways that a person can become less able to participate.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to start with kind of setting, to really understand inequity and oppression in this country, we have to go back to the founding of the US. And we're going to start with a very quick overview just to like all get on the same page and kind of have a foundation to jump off of. So settler colonialism refers to the system originated when European settlers came to the New World to colonize it in its early years. The New World was seen as wild and uninhibited, It actually was home, as we all know, to thousands of indigenous societies across the continent. And to gain control of the land and the resources, settlers had to eradicate the indigenous population and take the land. And I just want to invite, I should have said this before we jumped in, but just like, it's hard for me. It's like every time I rehear this, it's hard to take in again and just do what you need to do to take care of your body and stay grounded and support yourself to be present in the conversation. So when I say settler colonialism, it's referring to the system of Europeans coming to the New World, as I said. And a big part of that process was indigenous land theft. Around the same time, chattel slavery was formed as the outcome of the transatlantic slave trade from Africa to the US. And chattel slavery means that people were considered property of their owners. And through this system, African slaves were valued for their bodies, but not seen as fully human. So on one hand, we have the eradication of indigenous people and lifeways, and indigenous people seen as a block to colonial progress or as a barrier that needed to be overcome for the colonial project to gain the power and resources and land that it required. And then you have chattel slavery, which was a system of stolen labor, stealing people, and like creating this property system. So the formation of the US was born out of both of these two pieces as pillars, really, requiring indigenous land theft and chattel slavery to maintain power. In other words, you have stolen land and stolen labor that are both kind of funneling towards the accumulation of wealth. So that's the foundation of the US, and it's evolved over the last 200 years. And it's very much alive and well today. So what we see from this system is a system of racial capitalism, where racial capitalism racializes everyone for the pursuit of wealth, power, accumulation. Slavery evolved into Jim Crow and the Great Migration, when newly freed Black folks moved north from the South, where there were enormous structural blocks to gaining economic independence, safety, sovereignty in the South, any of the benefits or like access to safety required to like have land, grow food, have independence and security. Redlining, the police state, mass incarceration, and anti-Blackness are all functions of that original value system. And indigenous land theft continues today in the form of indigenous erasure and continued occupation of indigenous lands. So, and we see at the top settler colonialism, giving way to continued white supremacy and Christian hegemony. Now, over the last several centuries, often the US is referred to as a nation of immigrants. We have more people moving here, but that term contributes to indigenous erasure and continued anti-Blackness. As US has continued, immigrants have to the system and under this system become either assimilable immigrants. So that means like a proximity to whiteness, which reinforces white supremacy and anti-Blackness, or unassimilable immigrants, folks who don't have proximity to whiteness or can't assimilate into whiteness. So it's important for us as Jews, or many of us who have Jewish immigrant ancestors, it's important to reckon with our own history and how our families have funneled into this system, how this system has defined us and shaped us and put us into, how we're functioning inside of this and what we've gained and lost by participating. Yeah, so I think just in summary, all wealth and power is created through this system, and the continued exploitation and oppression of land and labor, specifically Black and Indigenous and POC land and labor. And there's been little to no state level repair or restitution for this system and its enormous impacts on those marginalized by it. So that's where we land today with the need for repair. And I just want to invite us to take a breath. Just notice what's happening in your body. I think I'm like tightening up here. And if there's any part of you that's activated, notice the gravity that's pulling your body down, notice the earth under you. And this is really hard stuff. Yeah, it's just hard stuff to look at this and look at the ways that we're complicit and the ways that we're participating and the ways that we're impacted by it. So just yes to the grief or anger or shame that might be coming up, and invite us to take a moment to honor it and offer it up if you want to send it down or up. We're going to move into Shmita, about 3,000 years back in time, and look at this one vision of how to prevent a situation like racial capitalism. So maybe just write in the chat, or you can unmute, and just when I say Shmita, what comes to mind? Like, what is Shmita? What do you know about it? Release. Let the land rest and regenerate. Forgive debts. Challenging ideas of personal property. So we all have different levels of relationship with this concept, and all levels of, whatever our understanding is of Shmita, it's welcome here. Riv says, cycle of 7 years, agricultural and social, debts forgiven, slaves have choice to leave their household. Get in touch with what's truly needed. Y'all are way ahead. So for the sake of this class, I'm going to say Shmita is a biblical concept of a cycle of 7 years in which the land rests in the 7th year, sort of like a Shabbat for the land, if we're thinking in fractal terms. And Shmita is a commandment or a mitzvah explicitly about the biblical land of Israel. And it is a model of creating a just economic system for an agricultural society, or the agricultural society that existed at the time that these texts were created, where we know Shmita from. So Shmita is mentioned many times in the Torah and Talmud. So these are just a couple texts to kind of give a window into the different aspects of it. And like I mentioned about Shmita, is if we're thinking about fractals, if we're thinking of Shabbat as a completion of a week, Shmita is the completion of 7 years. And then Yovel, like was mentioned earlier, is the completion of 7 Shmita cycles. After the 49th year of the 7th Shmita cycle, there is a 50th year called Yovel, or some people refer to as Jubilee year. The core of which is that the land holdings go back to their original owners. And I think as far as we know, we've lost track of that year, and it's unclear if it was ever practiced or if it ever happened. If we're going to focus on the elements of Shmita for a moment. So the 4 pieces are, does anyone want to read? Does anyone feel up for reading this slide?
I can read. Cease cultivation. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Free slaves. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year he shall go free without payment. Invite the poor to gather food from the land. Let the needy among your people eat of it. And forgive debts. Every 7th year, every creditor shall remit the due he claims from his fellow or kinsman, for the remission proclaimed is of the Lord.
Thank you. So this is another way of looking at just another way of mapping the concepts that we just read. We have a triangle with Shmita in the center, and in one corner we have free slaves, which in the text it's free Hebrew slaves. In one corner we have release of the land, another corner, and I chose to kind of merge these together because I saw them as being connected: forgive debts and share resources. Both of those being ways that Shmita asks us to support the economically marginalized. So the Torah sets forth a vision, and it gives instructions for the practice of Shmita. It's forward thinking. It's this is what you should do. This is very important. And it's specifically instructions for the practice of Shmita once the Jewish people are settled in the biblical land of Israel, which has very specific borders and is a pretty different concept than the modern nation state of Israel. But in history, we don't actually know what happened. The Torah doesn't know what happened. So how were these instructions applied over the past few thousand years? What we know is that throughout history, the Jews have struggled to make sense of this commandment, and it's possibly never really fully manifested. I'm gonna breeze over this one, but it's a quote from Pirkei Vote that's just pointing us to how important of how like central this commandment of Shmita was. Exile comes upon the world on account of idolatry, sexual immorality, murder, and the failure to observe the Shmita. So we see Pirkei Vote here putting Shmita with the other three, putting the failure to observe Shmita with kind of like the three big sins of Judaism, and resulting in exile, which people might have a lot of different feelings about exile. In another class, someone was like, is that really a punishment? And we could have a whole other world of conversation about that. But for the sake of the text, exile is often spoken about as a consequence, a really big consequence. Throughout history, there was the creation of the Prose Bowl, which was a loophole law that allowed putting money into institutions for the year of Shmita. In the late 1880s, when there were since then, there's been sort of a modern reckoning with like, well, how do we practice this? So that is like such a light touch into Shmita, and we could really go deeper into all of those elements. And I think also everybody, and I'm like excited to learn from everyone in the room who's bringing your own wisdom and knowledge of this, and please feel free to use the chat to like elaborate on anything that I'm touching on. But the question I want to ask is like, how could this traditional system challenge oppression and domination? And how might it have been designed to do that? How could it do that? And if you have time in your breakout group, you could think of some examples. And we're going to spend 4 minutes or so on that question. We'll come back and do some sharing. Yeah, I think like hearing, definitely there's just so much context inside of each piece of all of this. And there's so many questions about what was the system of Shmita created in response to, like what existed then, what existed then, and what was the vision of how it was supposed to be practiced. And I really love all these questions to take with us into the rest of the learning. In kind of my own reflections on Shmita, I think what stood out to me was that what it really felt like was that the laws of Shmita provided these like structural mechanisms to prevent the accumulation of wealth and exploitation of land and labor. And Laura, you're totally right that does mean that there were these like harmful exploitative relationships with land and labor to begin with. And even though there are these preventative mechanisms, it's like still based on some assumption of those practices. But I'm still struck by just like, whoever wrote these texts having this like premonition of like being able to predict racial capitalism in a way, or like being able to predict that this is what humans are capable of, and outlining a system that provided structural commandment around avoiding these like extremely painful outcomes. And from just other sources are from reformjudaism.com, Shmita defined as release was seen as like this essential prescription for maintaining economic, environmental, and social balance in the world. It's been cited, I think, I read a text that was like Prophet Jeremiah cited it as like failing to observe Shmita was why the destruction of the Second Temple happened. It's sort of held as this like extreme ideal, this very, very central commandment. And still looking at history, we can see that we've struggled to ever actually practice Shmita over time, whether in the biblical land of Israel or in exile. And it brings the question of like, does it actually function as a cohesive system? Is it possible? So we're going to move into the next section.
Can I just
Started with,
Can I just say something about the sort of maybe on the slavery? We learn in Exodus and Mishpatim, which is sort of right after we got the Ten Commandments, and that I sort of had this understanding that we were to remember that we were slaves in Egypt, and that we should remember that we shouldn't hold. I know it only says Hebrew slaves, but that we shouldn't we know what it was like to be a slave, and that therefore we should not enslave our own. Sort of my take on sort of thinking, even though that part in Exodus is sort of still offensive about, how you come as a slave and how you leave as a slave is offensive, but just sort of the idea of sort of being reminded what it was like to be a slave.
mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for saying that. It's definitely a question for me looking at it and seeing the text around freeing of Hebrew slaves specifically, and it definitely begs the question of like what economic system is this speaking to, and we don't know the context of what slavery looked like during that time and who were slaves, and why would it just be about enslaving our own? I think when I read it, I'm like, oh, it's like referring to like a contained society, but there's a lot of missing information. So we started with the formation of the US and the last couple centuries, and then we went back in time 2,000 to 3,000 years, and now we're going to look towards the future. And we know that harm has been done through this system that we are all part of. Shmita was given to us as a commandment, as a preventative, but it never happened. And now we have a call for healing through reparations after the fact. I think of reparations as state level accountability, state level repair for past and continued harms. And reparations refers to a lot of different things that we'll go over in a little bit. And the slide deck that's shared in the chat has a lot more slides that I'm skipping over, but there's more info there for anybody who's excited to have more information and things to look back to. Thanks, Jesse. So this is a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates from the book, We Were 8 Years in Power. What is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. What I'm talking about is more than a recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. And as we're kind of going through these huge topics and going in and out of like micro, macro, I just like the threads that it feels really interesting to me to follow the threads of the connections between economic and spiritual healing and economic and spiritual systems. I'm going to read a quote from Reverend Garrison Frazier, who was after the Civil War. Let's see. I really liked this. The 40 acres and a mule, 40 acres and a mule, this phrase that's really common, or that is like familiar, was a policy to give newly freed Black citizens 40 acres after the Civil War and after the end of chattel slavery. It was signed into law and then canceled in the same year in 1865. And this quote, basically two generals in the South met with a group of Black community leaders to ask what folks wanted in this new time. And one of them said, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn it and till it by our own labor, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. We want to be placed on our land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. So 40 acres and a mule was this policy that was about giving newly freed Black citizens land as a basis of independence and building safety and security, in part you know, this person was saying like, that's the core of what we need to make life. And it's sort of become a rallying cry, even though it never happened. It's become a like rallying cry of kind of like the forgotten promises of that era and the symbolism of what could have been. So reparations can look a lot of different ways. It was helpful for me in researching for this class, just understanding like, what is reparations? And there's all these movements for it and calls for it, but actually it's happened. There have been instances of reparations throughout history, and it means a lot of different things. So in terms of state level restitution, these are some examples. Reparations can take the form of cash payouts to individual survivors or descendants of the societal harm that reparations is responding to. It can look like land return, investment in community infrastructure, free access to education and healthcare, public apology and acknowledgement, public memorials. And yeah, I want to invite maybe folks here know like what are some examples, either historical or current examples of reparations. You can write in the chat, or you can unmute, actually, it's a small enough group. Returning cultural objects from museums to their original populations.
I know that there is a group of students at Georgetown Law School that organized to, to return money, to return funds to the descendants of the slaves that had built Georgetown. And that's it's an ongoing project.
In the East Bay, Shumi land tax is an example of reparations. Germany giving money to Israel is definitely an example of reparations. And I think Germany has paid Israel like over $89 billion. And you can see like over the course of those reparations payments, Israel's GDP has tripled. Shumi land tax, non-native folks paying land tax for being on stolen land, free herbal CSA program happening for BIPOC folks, nervous system regulation, yes. Thank you for all these examples. Winona LaDuke says the only compensation for land is land, and at Link of Legal, we really try to focus on land reparations just being a project that's asking questions around relationship to land, and land being like a lens into our like economic and spiritual healing, action, power. Winona LaDuke is an Indigenous activist working on issues of sustainable development, renewable energy and food systems. And she lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. Right now, they're part of a big effort to resist Line 3 pipeline. Land reparations specifically means giving land to members of the harmed community. So the story I told at the beginning about Link of Legal and Wild Seed is an example of land reparations. I think there was an example of land reparations in Esalen, with the Esalen tribe recently. That was really exciting to hear about. I don't know if anybody knows more about that. I'd love if you want to share in the chat. Oh, I'm going to share my sound. I think I'm actually going to skip this little video because the sound is being weird and we're a little short on time, but I really recommend everyone watch it. Ed Whitfield is really, really brilliant. And he's just speaking really succinctly to the importance of specifically land reparations. So as were mentioned in the chat, native land tax is a really powerful movement for reparations right now, specifically individuals and organizations paying dues for being on stolen land. So examples of that are Segorite and Shumi land tax in the Bay Area, Manhattan Fund in Manhattan, Real Rent Duwamish in Seattle, and Link of Legal, among I think many other organizations, has a 10% land tax where we like charge a tax to all of our sales and donations. And this map is a reparations map that was created by Soulfire Farm, which is a farm in Troy, New York, working to end racism in the food system, doing a lot of really powerful education, organizing work, and just growing beautiful food. And they made this map that you can visit to find reparations land projects all over the country. Black, Indigenous, and POC-led land projects. And if you have a Black, Indigenous, POC-led land project, you can reach out to them to be put on the map. Oh, my screen sharing's paused. Can you see? Can you see the reparations map?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Thank you. Yeah, so I really recommend checking out this map. It's a really powerful resource. And then there's also like a lot of debate around how to use this term reparations. I've heard some people believe reparations can only be made at the state level and ask for individual redistribution of wealth and land to be referred to as radical redistribution. Others call it person-to-person reparations. This image is pulled from our fundraiser this past year, where we invited folks to both give to Link of Legal and make a match gift to a BIPOC-led land project through finding one near your community through the reparations map. So this is just an example of person-to-person reparations. We're going to shift into breakout groups. And the question is, if you imagine Shmita as a functioning system today, how would it impact the system of racial capitalism? And obviously there's like quite a lot about Shmita that we haven't learned yet, or that maybe we're holding in that we haven't gotten to say in the full space yet. So feel free to share anything that feels relevant to this conversation. And we're going to spend maybe a little less than 10 minutes in breakout groups. Maybe we'll do 8 minutes, and we'll come back and do some sharing and continue. To hear a couple of shares of what y'all were talking about.
Hi, Soul. This is Barry.
Hi, Barry.
I'm in Austin. It's great to see you.
So nice to see you.
It's the concept of Shmita is fascinating, and it's completely new to me. And I apologize if you already covered this in the beginning. But my question is really about what was the intent of Shmita at the time it was being implemented? Are we making assumptions about it now based on kind of our current times, or what do we know about the intention and of when it was actually implemented?
Really good question. Definitely a theme of this class so far. And I will just say explicitly that I am making assumptions about it, and I am cherry picking the pieces of it that I want to use to tell a story. And like, yeah, and there's like quite a complex history, and I definitely don't know all of it. And this exercise is meant to be like, we're like taking this kind of like imaginal system of Shmita and thinking like, what are the values that like, what values are we pulling from this, and how is it like connected to the change that we want to see? And it's a really good question. I'm excited to like look into trying to learn more about it leaving this space. Anyone else want to share from your conversation?
I can share that. Oh, someone.
I think you can go for it. I don't.
Okay. I was thinking about how like the harms of racial capitalism capitalism just kind of keeps snowballing, that there's like never been a repair, that like 40 acres and a mule never happened, and that history since like the start of the colonial United States has been these escalating harms, and that imagine some of the mechanisms of Shmita would be like breaks to that or something, like wouldn't necessarily like fix everything, but would kind of like slow the kind of escalating harm.
Cool. I'm gonna go jump in. I can't see who you are, but go for it.
Okay, it's Molly. We talked about, we kind of like spun a little bit about it, and then we started talking about, similar to what the last person shared, that like, because there has been this generational disparity and no access to any sort of reset button, that if Shmita was something that was in place, there would just be this extremely different access to opportunity than there currently is because of the reset that Shmita would offer. And that it's still possible that like there would be some sort of racialized capitalism, but it would last for a certain amount of time, and then there would be an opportunity for resetting to take. And just how different a 6-year span of that is with opportunity for change than the current existence of like centuries without any reset.
Yeah, that prevention. So this is just the same slide from the beginning. The laws of Shmita providing structural mechanisms to prevent the accumulation of wealth and exploitation of land and labor. And in preparing for this class, like I just want to share some diagrams of kind of like the thinking that was coming up for me. And this is very simplified, but like I was saying around like using this imaginal system to kind of like create a narrative that inspires my own like sense of accountability and like inspiration for action. It was really helpful for me to like, I woke up in the middle of the night and was like, oh, this actually like maps, if we like take it at face value, it maps very directly on. And so you have release and return of the land. So release of the land every 7 years, return of the land in the 50th year to its original owners. Kind of in direct opposition to this system of indigenous land theft. Freeing slaves, which we've named is about Hebrew slaves and is like a specific / complex thing, but that concept is challenging this concept of slavery. And then forgiving debts and sharing resources. When you look at it together, if a system like this was functioning, like a system of racial capitalism wouldn't work, and the pillars of it would crumble. And it was really helpful for my brain to just see this and be like, oh, if it like is directly mapped on, it's like in opposition. And just again, like being brought back to whoever conceived of Shmita or wherever this commandment came from, it's like rooted in a lot of brilliance around being able to predict kind of the like greed and harm that can come from like a human driven economic system. And even taking this even further, I was like, okay, well, what does that actually look like in practice if we think about forgiving debts, release and return of the land, freeing slaves? Examples of that to me are like indigenous land return and Black land reparations and abolition and redistribution of wealth. So moving from that, we're like super coming in on the last few minutes, but I just wanted to ask, like have some space for some open conversation of like, what, if we've established that Shmita and racial capitalism, like that there's like a tension there, that there's what to learn from Shmita that would challenge this system that we want to end. How can we utilize aspects of this to fight racial capitalism and work for reparations today in our own lives? And what does applying that actually look like? And I'm curious if anybody has thoughts or like things bubbling from this conversation.
So I want to bring up something that came up in the chat, which is really important and often not really talked about in Shmita classes, which is that, this was a system built for and on occupied land itself, that the original that every 50 years there was a demarcation about tribal land that was based on the 12 tribes of Israel, but we occupied Canaanite land. Like, like it's supposed to be a just system, you know, on the heels of occupation, which is the, you know, has a long history in the Fertile Crescent and around the world. So I just wanted to hear what, I don't know, what you or other folks feel and think about the fact that, you know, our system is not about indigeneity from, like, you know, Adam and Chava, like it is a complicated story in itself.
Thanks for bringing that. Do folks have thoughts?
I guess I really appreciate you saying that, Ariella, and I think you know, I'll say it feels like a much longer conversation I want to have. So I'll just bookmark that also, and say that one of the things that comes to mind is sort of from braiding sweetgrass and other worlds of learning of, like, what does it mean to be in right relationship with the land that we're on. And you know, I can't say that the 12 tribes were in right relationship with the Canaanites who they, like, destroyed when they arrived, or kicked out. So it definitely feels a lot more complex than that. But it does seem to me like an interesting question if it's not about indigeneity, but it's actually about something different, about relationship with land that doesn't belong to us, that ultimately belongs to God, or belongs to, yeah, that's beyond ownership in a certain way. So, but I'd love to talk more with folks about that.
Yeah, I would too. I feel like when I think about Shmita, and I have a very, like, I think just a basic understanding without a lot of historical context around, like, the system that this instruction, like what it was responding to and where it originated from. But I'm really curious about, like, the juxtaposition between what was happening and then the values that were being communicated. And both what it was responding to, but also, like, what it was, yeah, and also what systems of power it was possibly trying to protect. It is 6:15, which I think is the end of our time. And I feel like we're just really about to open. But really, yeah, just really grateful for all of you bringing your presence and really, really smart thoughts and questions, and excited to chew on all of this more. I just wanted to share this last slide, which is, if you're excited to learn more, and I want to add to this slide at some point more of the, like, Jewish history and kind of like textual background. But if you're excited to learn more about any of the things that we talked about on the reparations side, these are some resources and some actions of ways to support movements for reparations. And I think that we'll do a little closing, and would love to stay in touch with all of you. And if you want to stay up to date on what Link of Legal is up to, you can join our mailing list at linkoflegal.com. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.